The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Michael Carter pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Morrison Industries. It was past 11 p.m., and the 38th floor was silent, except for the soft squeak of wheels on polished marble. When his phone buzzed, he answered without thinking, switching to the gentle Arabic he reserved for his 8-year-old daughter. "Habibti, Baba will be home soon, I promise." Behind the glass wall of the corner office, Sarah Mitchell froze mid-signature on a contract worth millions. The CEO had been working late again, drowning herself in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. But something about that voice made her pen slip from her fingers. She stood slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs as memories she'd buried for 2 years came flooding back. Sarah had heard that exact tone before, in another life, from another man who used to whisper Arabic endearments in the dark. What she didn't know was that this chance encounter would change everything she thought she knew about the quiet janitor who cleaned her building every night. Michael Carter hadn't always been a janitor. 3 years ago, he'd been a literature professor at a small college in Connecticut, teaching students about the beauty of Arabic poetry and the universal themes that connected all human experience. His wife Elena had been his anchor, the woman who'd encouraged him to pursue his passion for teaching while she worked as a nurse to support their growing family. But cancer had other plans, and the medical bills that followed her diagnosis consumed their savings like wildfire. By the time Elena passed away, Michael was left with nothing but debt, a broken heart, and a little girl who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. The university couldn't hold his position while he struggled to balance grief and single parenthood, so he'd taken the first job he could find that offered decent pay and flexible hours. Cleaning offices at night meant he could be home when Layla got off the school bus, help her with homework, and tuck her into bed before heading out to work. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but it was the life he'd been given. Sarah Mitchell knew something about loss too, though she kept that knowledge locked away behind designer suits and boardroom confidence. 2 years ago, she'd been married to Dr. James Mitchell, a humanitarian doctor who spent half his time in refugee camps and the other half trying to convince her to slow down and start a family. James had been fluent in Arabic, having learned it during his medical missions in Syria and Lebanon, and Sarah had loved falling asleep to the sound of his voice, practicing phrases or reading poetry aloud. Their marriage had been a whirlwind of passion and purpose, but it ended just as suddenly when James died in a car accident on his way home from the airport after a 6-month mission. The inheritance from his family's medical practice had made her wealthy beyond measure, but all the money in the world couldn't fill the silence in their empty penthouse. Sarah had thrown herself into work, transforming her grief into the ruthless efficiency that had made Morrison Industries one of the most successful consulting firms on the East Coast. But tonight, hearing that gentle Arabic voice, she felt something crack open inside her chest. The next morning, Sarah found herself taking the elevator to the 38th floor earlier than usual, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her coffee cup. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with memories of James and questions about the man who'd unknowingly reopened wounds she thought had healed. As she walked past the supply closet, she noticed something she'd never seen before, a small piece of paper tucked behind the water cooler with elegant Arabic script written in blue ink. Sarah's heart stopped as she recognized the handwriting style, the same careful loops and flourishes that James used to practice. She couldn't read the words, but something about the rhythm of the script made her think of poetry, of the verses James used to whisper when he thought she was asleep. Michael appeared around the corner at that moment, pushing his cart and whistling softly under his breath. When he saw her standing there with the paper in her hand, his face went pale, and he quickly looked away. "I'm sorry, Mum. I didn't mean to leave any mess," he said, reaching for the paper with obvious embarrassment. But Sarah pulled it back, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "What does it say?" Michael's surprise was evident as he studied her face, searching for any sign of mockery or condescension. When he found none, his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he cleared his throat. "It's about hope," he said simply. "About finding light in dark places, even when you think you're lost forever." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked down at the paper again, remembering how James used to say similar things about his work, about believing in humanity even when the world seemed determined to prove him wrong. "My husband used to write poetry," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He was a doctor, but he loved languages, loved the way different cultures expressed the same emotions through different words." Michael nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Poetry is the universal language," he said. "It speaks to the parts of us that don't have words in any tongue." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found an unexpected connection in the sterile hallway of a corporate building. Then Sarah did something that surprised them both. She asked if he'd like to have coffee sometime, not as his boss, but as someone who understood the weight of carrying beautiful words in a world that often felt too harsh for poetry. Their first real conversation happened 3 days later in a small cafe 2 blocks from the Morrison building. Sarah had chosen the place carefully, somewhere neutral where the obvious differences in their circumstances wouldn't feel so stark. Michael arrived exactly on time, wearing his best button-down shirt and carrying a worn leather notebook that he kept fidgeting with throughout their talk. Sarah learned that he'd been a professor, that he'd lost his wife to cancer, that he was raising his daughter alone while trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by circumstances beyond his control. She told him about James, about the foundation she'd been thinking of starting in his memory, about how she'd been going through the motions of living without really being alive. When Michael mentioned that he sometimes wrote poetry on his breaks, Sarah asked if he'd share something with her. He opened his notebook with trembling hands and read a piece about resilience, about how trees bend in storms but rarely break, about finding strength in flexibility rather than rigidity. His voice was soft but confident, and Sarah found herself transported back to those nights when James would read to her from books of verse collected during his travels. As Michael finished reading, she realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the recognition of finding someone who spoke the same emotional language, even if they came from completely different worlds. The revelation came 2 weeks later, when Sarah was going through James's papers to set up the foundation she'd been planning in his memory. Hidden in a folder marked Personal Projects were dozens of letters and reports from his time working in refugee camps, along with photographs of the people he'd helped and stories of their journeys to safety. One name appeared repeatedly in his notes: Professor M. Carter, listed as a translator and cultural liaison who'd volunteered his time to help newly arrived Syrian families navigate the complex process of resettlement. Sarah's hands shook as she read James's detailed accounts of working with this mysterious Professor Carter, whom he'd described as brilliant, compassionate, and utterly dedicated to helping others find their footing in a new world. The description included mention of Carter's own tragic story, how he'd lost his wife and had to leave his teaching position to support his young daughter. Sarah realized with growing amazement that the quiet janitor she'd been meeting for coffee was the same man her husband had written about with such admiration and respect. James had planned to offer Carter a position with the foundation, but the accident had happened before he could make contact. As Sarah sat surrounded by her husband's papers, she felt as though the universe had conspired to bring her and Michael together, as if James himself had orchestrated this unlikely connection from beyond the grave. When Sarah told Michael about the connection the next day, his reaction was everything she'd expected, and more. He went completely still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, as she explained about finding his name in James's files. "Dr. James Mitchell," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The man who spent 6 months at the Richardson camp, who helped get medical care for the elderly refugees, who insisted on learning everyone's name and story. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she watched understanding dawn in Michael's eyes. "He wrote about you," she said. "Pages and pages about your work, about how you helped families preserve their dignity while learning to navigate a new culture. He called you the most important person in the camp, the bridge between their old world and their new one." Michael set down his coffee cup with shaking hands and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his photos until he found what he was looking for. The image showed a group of refugees celebrating a successful citizenship ceremony. And there in the background, wearing scrubs and a tired but genuine smile, was James. "He saved my neighbor's father," Michael said quietly. "When Mr. Hassan had a heart attack, your husband worked for 16 hours straight to stabilize him, then stayed with the family until they knew he'd be okay. I never forgot his kindness." They sat in silence for a long moment, both overwhelmed by the impossible coincidence that had brought them together. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and took Michael's hand. "I think," she said carefully, "that James would want us to finish what he started." The plan Sarah presented to Michael the following week was ambitious beyond anything he'd dared to imagine. She'd been working with lawyers and accountants to establish the Hope Bridge Foundation, a $10 million initiative designed to help refugee families transition successfully to life in America. The foundation would provide language classes, job training, cultural orientation, and most importantly, a network of support that would help newcomers maintain their dignity while building new lives. Sarah wanted Michael to serve as the foundation's director, using his linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and natural empathy to create programs that would truly make a difference. The salary she offered was more than double what he'd made as a professor, enough to give Layla the education she deserved and to finally pay off the medical debt that had been haunting him for years. But Michael's first instinct was to refuse, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the offer and convinced that he wasn't qualified for such an important position. "I'm just a janitor," he said, the words heavy with years of diminished self-worth. "I clean floors and empty trash cans. I don't run foundations or manage budgets or make decisions that affect people's lives." Sarah leaned forward, her expression fierce with conviction. "You're not just anything," she said firmly. "You're a teacher, a poet, a translator, a bridge between worlds. You're exactly the person James would have chosen for this job, and you're exactly the person I need to make this foundation everything it can be." The opposition came from an unexpected source. Richard Blackwood, the longest-serving member of Morrison Industries' board of directors, had been suspicious of Sarah's recent behavior and had hired a private investigator to look into her activities. When he learned about her plans for the foundation and her relationship with Michael, he saw an opportunity to undermine her authority and position himself as the voice of reason among the company's stakeholders. Richard called an emergency board meeting, presenting a file thick with information about Michael's background, his financial struggles, and his connections to refugee communities that Richard characterized as potential security risks. He painted a picture of Sarah as an emotionally compromised widow being manipulated by a smooth-talking opportunist who was using her grief to gain access to her wealth. The presentation was masterfully crafted, playing on board members' fears about liability and reputation while carefully avoiding overtly racist language. Richard's argument was simple. The foundation was a noble idea, but putting someone with Michael's background in charge was asking for trouble. Surely there were more qualified candidates, people with proper credentials and established track records who could run the foundation without creating unnecessary risks for the company. The board voted to table the foundation proposal pending further investigation, effectively freezing Sarah's plans and leaving Michael wondering if he'd been foolish to believe that someone like him could ever be trusted with something so important. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her professional life. She'd built her career on being diplomatic, on finding common ground and building consensus, but Richard's attack on Michael had triggered something primal and protective in her. She requested a private meeting with Richard, ostensibly to discuss his concerns about the foundation, but really to understand why he'd gone to such lengths to investigate and undermine someone he'd never even met. Richard was confident and condescending, explaining that he was simply looking out for the company's best interests and Sarah's reputation. He suggested that her judgment had been compromised by grief and loneliness, that she was being taken advantage of by someone who saw her wealth as an opportunity for personal gain. "You barely know this man," Richard said with patronizing concern. "You're letting your emotions cloud your business judgment, and it's going to reflect poorly on all of us." Sarah listened quietly until he finished, then delivered her response with the cold precision that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in the industry. She'd done her own investigation, she informed him, and had discovered that Richard had been systematically embezzling funds from the company's charitable giving account for the past 3 years. She had documentation, witnesses, and a clear paper trail that would not only destroy his career, but likely land him in prison. Richard could either resign from the board immediately and disappear quietly, or she could present her findings to the authorities and let them decide his fate. The choice, she said sweetly, was entirely his. With Richard gone and the board appropriately chastened, Sarah was free to move forward with the foundation, but she discovered that Michael's confidence had been shaken more deeply than she'd realized. The investigation had dredged up painful memories of the suspicion and scrutiny he'd faced when he first arrived in America, the countless forms and interviews and background checks that had made him feel like a criminal rather than a refugee seeking safety. Even though he'd been cleared of any wrongdoing, the experience had reinforced his belief that he didn't belong in Sarah's world, that he was foolish to think he could ever be more than what he appeared to be on the surface. When Sarah found him in the building late one night, he was clearing out his locker and preparing to quit his job. "I can't do this," he said, without looking at her. "I can't pretend to be someone I'm not, and I can't put you in a position where you have to defend me against people who will never see me as anything more than a threat." Sarah felt her heart break as she watched him fold his work uniforms and pack away the small personal items that had made his locker feel like a tiny piece of home. She thought about James, about the stories he'd told of refugees who'd given up on their dreams because the world had convinced them they didn't deserve better. "What would you tell one of your students?" she asked quietly. "If one of them came to you and said they wanted to quit because someone had made them feel unworthy, what would you say?" Michael stopped packing and turned to face her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd tell them that other people's limitations don't define our possibilities," he said. "That we honor our loved ones by refusing to let fear make us smaller than we were meant to be." Sarah nodded, stepping closer until she was standing right in front of him. "Your wife didn't sacrifice so you could spend the rest of your life playing it safe," she said gently. "She sacrificed so you could build something meaningful, something that would make her proud. My husband didn't dedicate his life to helping people just so I could let his work die with him." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. "This was James's," she said, placing it in Michael's hands. "He wrote in it every night when he was working in the camps, recording the stories of the people he met, the challenges they faced, the dreams they carried. I want you to have it, to add your own stories to his, to continue building the bridge between worlds that you both believed in so deeply." Michael opened the journal with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting he remembered from their brief time working together. On the last page James had written, he found a note dated just days before the accident. "Must find Professor Carter. He's the key to making this work. The refugees trust him, and he understands both worlds. Without him, the foundation will just be another charity. With him, it could change everything." The Hope Bridge Foundation opened its doors 6 months later in a converted warehouse in Westport, Connecticut, just a few miles from the Morrison Industries headquarters. The space was warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas, computer stations, and classrooms designed to feel more like community centers than institutional facilities. Michael had insisted on having a children's area where parents could bring their kids during classes, knowing from experience how hard it was to find childcare while trying to build a new life. The walls were decorated with artwork from local refugee artists, photographs of successful graduates, and inspirational quotes in multiple languages. On opening day, Sarah stood in the main hallway watching Michael lead a group of newly arrived Syrian families through their orientation, his voice patient and encouraging as he explained the various programs available to them. She could see the relief in their faces as they realized they'd found someone who understood their journey, someone who could help them navigate the complex process of building new lives while honoring their cultural heritage. Layla was there too, having convinced her father to let her help with the children's program, her bright smile and bilingual chatter making the younger kids feel immediately at home. Watching them together, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced since James's death, a sense that she was finally fulfilling the promise she'd made to continue his work. The foundation's first major success came just 3 months after opening, when a program graduate named Hassan al-Rashid started his own small business with a microloan from the foundation's entrepreneurship program. Hassan had been a master carpenter in Syria, but had spent 2 years working in a warehouse because no one would recognize his skills or give him a chance to prove himself. Michael had connected him with a local contractor who was willing to evaluate his work based on ability rather than credentials. And within weeks, Hassan was creating custom furniture pieces that were being featured in upscale boutiques throughout Connecticut. The local newspaper ran a feature story about Hassan's journey, highlighting the foundation's role in helping skilled immigrants contribute their talents to their new communities. The story caught the attention of other media outlets, and soon Michael found himself being interviewed for magazines and podcasts about the foundation's innovative approach to refugee resettlement. He was uncomfortable with the attention at first, preferring to let the foundation's work speak for itself. But Sarah convinced him that visibility was important for attracting funding and support. "People need to see the human faces behind the statistics," she reminded him. "They need to understand that refugees aren't just people who need help. They're people who have incredible gifts to offer if we just give them the opportunity." As the foundation grew and expanded its programs, Sarah found herself spending more and more time in Westport, working alongside Michael to develop new initiatives and secure additional funding. Their relationship had evolved from professional colleagues to true partners, sharing not only the work of running the foundation, but also the personal satisfaction of seeing their efforts make a real difference in people's lives. They'd developed an easy rhythm of collaboration, with Sarah handling the business and administrative aspects, while Michael focused on program development and direct service delivery. Their different backgrounds and skills complemented each other perfectly, and they'd learned to trust each other's judgment in their respective areas of expertise. But there was something else growing between them too, something neither of them had acknowledged, but both had begun to feel. It showed up in the way Michael's face lit up when Sarah walked into a room, in the way Sarah found excuses to stay late when she knew Michael would be working on program materials, in the small gestures of consideration and care that had become second nature to both of them. Layla had noticed it too, and had started making increasingly obvious attempts to play matchmaker, inviting Sarah to school events and family dinners, asking pointed questions about whether she was lonely living in that big house all by herself. The moment everything changed happened on a rainy Thursday evening in late autumn. Sarah had been working late at the foundation, reviewing grant applications and preparing for a board meeting, when she heard the sound of Michael's voice coming from the main classroom. She looked up to see him reading poetry to a group of teenage refugees, his voice rich with emotion as he translated verses from Arabic to English and back again, helping the students understand how the same feelings could be expressed in different languages but retain their essential truth. The students were completely absorbed, some of them writing in notebooks, others just listening with the kind of attention that spoke to deep recognition and understanding. Sarah found herself drawn to the doorway, watching and listening as Michael helped the young people explore their own experiences through the lens of poetry, encouraging them to write their own verses about their journeys, their losses, their hopes for the future. When the class ended and the students filed out, chattering excitedly about the poems they wanted to work on for next week, Sarah stepped into the classroom. "That was beautiful," she said, and Michael turned to find her standing there with tears in her eyes. "They needed to hear that their stories matter," he said simply, "that their experiences are worthy of poetry, worthy of being preserved and shared." Sarah walked closer, her heart pounding with the recognition of something she'd been trying to ignore for months. "So do you," she said softly. "Your story matters too, Michael. Your poetry, your life, your dreams, they all matter." The kiss that followed was inevitable, born of months of growing affection and shared purpose, and the recognition that they'd found in each other something neither had expected to find again. It was gentle and tentative at first, both of them aware of the weight of their respective losses and the complexity of their situation. But as they held each other in the quiet classroom, surrounded by the evidence of the work they'd built together, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the grief that had kept her heart locked away for so long. Michael felt it too, the possibility of love that honored rather than betrayed the memory of what they'd lost, the chance to build something new without diminishing what had come before. They didn't talk about what it meant or where it might lead, but they both knew that something fundamental had changed between them, that they'd crossed a line from which there was no going back. As they finally pulled apart, Sarah noticed that Michael was wearing 2 bracelets on his left wrist, a silver one that she'd never seen before and a gold one that she recognized as having belonged to James. "The silver one was Eleanor's," he said, following her gaze. "She gave it to me just before she died. Said it would remind me to keep hoping even when everything felt dark." Sarah reached out to touch the gold bracelet, the one James had worn every day of their marriage. "He would have liked you," she said quietly. "He would have understood what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to build." Michael nodded, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I think they both would have approved," he said. "I think they would have wanted us to find each other." The months that followed were a time of careful navigation and gradual integration, as Sarah and Michael learned to balance their growing personal relationship with their professional partnership and their responsibilities to the foundation. They were both acutely aware of the potential for gossip and criticism, knowing that their unlikely romance would be scrutinized by those who questioned whether their relationship was genuine or opportunistic. But they also discovered that their connection made their work stronger, that their shared commitment to the foundation was deepened by their personal bond. They began spending more time together outside of work, with Sarah becoming a regular presence at Michael and Layla's dinner table, and Michael accompanying Sarah to the social events that came with running a high-profile non-profit. Layla was delighted with the development, having decided early on that Sarah would make a perfect addition to their small family, and she threw herself into the role of enthusiastic advocate for the relationship. She started calling Sarah Aunt Sarah without being asked, insisted on including her in family traditions and holiday celebrations, and made it clear to anyone who would listen that she approved wholeheartedly of her father's choice in companions. The foundation continued to grow and thrive, expanding its programs to serve refugees from multiple countries and cultures, and earning recognition as one of the most innovative and effective resettlement organizations in the region. Michael's confidence in his leadership abilities had grown along with the foundation's success, and he no longer questioned his right to occupy the position Sarah had offered him. The proposal came not as a dramatic gesture or carefully planned surprise, but as a natural evolution of conversations they'd been having for months about their future together. They were sitting in Sarah's living room one evening, Layla asleep upstairs in what had become her regular bedroom, when Michael mentioned that he'd been thinking about buying a house closer to the foundation. "Or," Sarah said carefully, "you could just move in here permanently, both of you." Michael looked at her with surprise and hope, knowing that she wasn't just talking about cohabitation, but about making a formal commitment to building a life together. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I know this is James's house, filled with his memories, his presence. I don't want to intrude on that or make you feel like you're betraying his memory." Sarah took his hand, her thumb tracing over the 2 bracelets he still wore every day. "This house has been a museum for too long," she said. "It needs to be a home again, filled with laughter and argument and the mess of everyday life. James would want that, just like Elena would want you to be happy." They didn't call it an engagement exactly, but they both understood that they were making a commitment to each other and to the life they'd built together. The wedding, when it came 6 months later, was a small ceremony held in the foundation's main classroom, with refugees from a dozen different countries joining their friends and family to celebrate the union of 2 people who'd found love in the most unexpected place. Layla served as the flower girl, beaming with pride as she walked down the aisle scattering rose petals, and the ceremony was conducted in both English and Arabic, honoring the cultural heritage that had brought Michael and Sarah together. 1 year later, the Hope Bridge Foundation was featured on the cover of Philanthropy Today magazine, with a story that highlighted its innovative programs and remarkable success rate in helping refugees achieve economic independence and cultural integration. The article included photographs of Michael and Sarah working with clients, leading staff meetings, and celebrating program graduations, capturing the partnership that had made the foundation's growth possible. But the image that readers remembered most was the final photograph, taken during a poetry reading event at the foundation. Michael stood at the front of the room, reading from a collection of verses written by program participants, while Sarah sat in the audience with Layla beside her, both of them listening with the kind of attention that spoke to deep love and pride. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Love finds a way to build bridges, even in the most unlikely places." But perhaps the most telling detail was one that only close observers would have noticed. On Michael's left wrist, barely visible beneath his suit jacket, were 2 bracelets, one silver and one gold, symbols of the love that had brought him to this moment, and the love that would carry him forward into whatever came next. The foundation had become more than either Sarah or Michael had imagined possible, serving hundreds of families and setting a new standard for refugee resettlement programs across the country. But its greatest success might have been in proving that hope, like love, has a way of appearing when we need it most, often in the form of the people we least expect to change our lives forever.